Welcome to Jargon, a podcast bringing clarity to commonly misunderstood business concepts. We're debunking and simplifying the buzzwords and ideas plaguing today's business world and offering a fresh perspective on these topics.
Hello, this is Bill Aimone.
And this is Todd Boutte.
Today, what are we going to talk about, Todd?
We're going to talk about the cloud a little bit. We're going to decode that word for some people, I think.
Yeah, we're finding out there in the market, if you're a company that's looking for new software, you hear the word cloud, and it's been out there for years. And I remember when I first heard the word cloud, it was IBM ads on TV, and I didn't know what the heck they were talking about.
Right.
And this was years ago. But cloud has become kind of I'll call it an overused term, and it really doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate, right? It did stem from the idea of a marketing term, but now, as consultants, we have an idea of what it should mean and what the technical specifications should be when we select software. So we want to turn, what we call cloud into kind of the reality, right?
So a couple of things we're going to talk about is one is cloud solutions, software as a service, how does that fit in, and how are companies really defining cloud, software as a service, and then also get into a little bit about, okay, there's softwares out there that are pretty new, how to address that, how to select software that's going to be fit for what you need and meet your expectations when it comes to the cloud. So Todd, when we hear the word cloud, we hear it overused all the time. And, I almost say, if I take your hardware and server and go put it in my garage instead of your garage, it's now in the cloud for you.
Well, yeah, from your perspective, it is, right? It's out of your office building. It's offsite somewhere. It might as well be, kind of the most basic definition of cloud, right? It's it's accessible only over the internet.
Yeah, or some means or another. And sometimes it's not even using a web browser. Sometimes companies will say, oh, we're in the cloud, and you have to use a Citrix or something to access a VPN or something, a network somewhere else. But even though it's over the internet, that's how you're connecting, because there's no other way to connect to somebody else unless you want to, use your tin cups and a string, right?
Right. So maybe we break it down from kind of the old methods to the new methods, right? So traditionally, enterprise software was going to be on premises in a server room somewhere, but maybe, likely physically in your building or the building next door.
A big air-conditioned room with raised floors and a whole bunch of computers and a bunch of lights blinking and spaghetti wires in the back, and make sure you don't unplug one of them and don't know where to plug it back in.
Exactly. So your only mechanism for accessing your software would be in the building by way of physical security and then PC security, right? And you would run your enterprise applications like that. And, to some extent, it's analog to what you're describing as the garage computer. To the people in the office building, the software is away. It's, the databases are put away. They're in the cloud, but they're not. They're in your building.
Right. So you've got software in your building, and one of the big reasons why cloud has become so popular, or the idea of software as a service or moving things off premise, is historically there was a lot of maintenance to take care of those computers. So if a piece of hardware went down or an upgrade happened, I'd have to upgrade the memory in the hardware. I'd have to upgrade possibly even some other components of it to be able to make it work. So if you think about it, I've bought some software and the software requires an upgrade. I've got to do a whole bunch of stuff. I've got to update the software, make sure it works, make sure it's ready to be deployed, and make sure the databases work, make sure the hardware works. And so then it requires you as a owner of a company, I've got to have the backup software and the backup hardware to be able to run the capability to be able to test it before I release something.
Absolutely, and you lacked any sort of scalability. The second you outgrew your hardware, it meant you needed to replace it and migrate your software, your databases, everything to new hardware. And so the next logical stepping stone was, okay, let's move our hardware to a data center to give some other company the ability to kind of maintain this for me, keep it up to date, monitor it, provide some other physical security where I don't have to worry about a flood or a fire or something in my building. But I still own hardware. It's just in somebody else's warehouse, and they do some security and maintenance for me. That is, I think, pretty much gone by the wayside. It still happens from time to time where you might own hardware in somebody else's facility. But that was the next logical stepping stone, and it alleviated some of those issues.
It did, and that was almost kind of your first step to getting out of the business of IT, because what would happen is, I remember, 20 years ago, the CIO would walk into the board and say, I need $10 million for a new data center. or data center upgrade. Of course, the board is going, wait a minute, I'd rather spend the $10 million on upgrading our manufacturing capabilities or buying some capital resources to be able to generate more revenue. So they would ask the IT guy or the CIO, hey, why are we spending $10 million? And they say, well, there's really no tangible benefits. It's all a bunch of stuff we have to do to get there. It wasn't like it was the wrong thing to do. It was the right thing to do at the time. But we really needed to avoid that. So that's the whole data center concept you're talking about. But then now we're talking about the idea of this word cloud that came up and people started pushing around. Tell me about where that's kind of started and where you've seen that happen.
Yeah, so that transition for me most logically happened from the idea that, okay, well, maybe there's a way for us to quit owning this hardware in somebody else's data center. And, that's the beginnings of IBM and Azure and AWS and even Google, these companies that have massive infrastructure and are willing to rent it to you and let you virtualize your applications, rent pieces of physical servers to run applications, host databases, use virtual machines, virtual Windows machines or development machines, whatever, things like that, where you stopped having to worry about ownership and uptime, and you would sign a contract. Put yourself in a position to jump onto a couple-year contract that includes certain guarantees of uptime and maintenance and reliability, scaling, all those types of things. And I would say that's still the most common way that people are sort of interacting with enterprise cloud software these days. They have a carve-out in a big data center somewhere that is allocated to them, but it's ostensibly no different than how they were operating with their own hardware in the data center and on-prem. They still have to keep up with maintenance and patching of the software, but at least they could rely on the hardware.
But there's two pieces of this, though. There's the hardware piece where I've said, okay, AWS, Amazon, or Microsoft Azure, or IBM, or any type of big software company, even at SAPs and Oracles, they have their own data center of sort where they can run other people's software.
They'll give you the infrastructure.
They give you the infrastructure piece. But then I've got the infrastructure piece sitting there, so I don't have to worry about physical hardware, unplugging and plugging stuff in and upgrading servers. If I have a scalability issue, I can just go ahead and request to have some more memory added to our agreement for the infrastructure. But then there's the piece of it where it comes to the software piece, and that's what we're seeing today. Software companies are coming out, and these are big software companies, Oracle, SAP, and I'm talking about these enterprise software applications, Infor, IFS, Microsoft, you name it. They all say the same thing. We're a cloud-based solution.
This is where the word starts to fall apart.
Exactly. And this is where companies are really getting confused about it. And they're saying, oh, we're cloud-based. What does that really mean? There is no technical definition of cloud out there. Contractually, you said you're in the cloud, but you're not really. And when you buy the software, you find out, wait a minute, we have to run patches. We have to do all these things. Let's break that down a little bit, Todd, because when people hear the word cloud, they think, I don't have to do anything. It's going to run by itself.
Right, and it's certainly not the case. I think the closest you get to that, and I think we'll cover this at the very end of this podcast, is when we start talking software as a service. But if we leave that aside for a moment, the descriptor or the description I was giving of kind of a rented or shared space in AWS or Azure, it was the entry point for kind of calling things cloud. And you're totally right, Bill. All that really meant was the hardware is now maintained and dealt with by somebody else, but your software versioning, your interoperability with other pieces of your software, the compatibility, the patching, it didn't really reduce IT overhead too much. And it still left you in a position where an Oracle update could come through and break interoperability with something else. And there's no mechanisms for you to stop any of that. You're still just running this enterprise software remotely.
Yeah, and what you really did is you just moved stuff around.
Yep.
So I still have to support the software. So even today, we're seeing on these selections we're helping companies with, companies are coming in and they're pitching their enterprise software, and we won't name any names to protect the innocent, but that's a whole other conversation. But for example, we had a enterprise software company come out to one of our selections, and they said we're in the cloud.
Right.
But what was it really?
What it really was they would take on the burden of sort of launching the virtualized machine and charge you for some upkeep and things.
So they're putting in an AWS
they
or
were
something.
A middleman. Exactly. They were just doing the things that you could have done on your own, essentially. And then they were calling that their cloud solution.
But the company buying the software still had to run the patches,
yes,
test them, and to make sure everything worked. It wasn't hands off.
No, not at all. And they would let their clients stay on whichever versions made sense for them. So there was no kind of universal version control across their software. So when it comes to support, every client needed a different level of support where they had to account for which version of their software they were on, which add-ons that they've used over time, what level of security they've implemented, what type of databases they use. None of this stuff was controlled at the highest level, with the software vendor.
And maybe we compare it to like a NetSuite or an Acumatica where they're built in the cloud, they're built for the cloud.
Yeah.
And that versus a software company that maybe is saying they're in the cloud, but they're not really because it wasn't built in the cloud. Why is that happening?
Why is that happening? I think there's a few reasons. And this is where those companies that you mentioned, like NetSuite, are having to use the terminology true cloud. They've had invented
as opposed to fake cloud.
Right. They've had to invent what they would have traditionally called a cloud, and they have to call it true cloud now, which for them means hands off. And this is where we can talk single tenant, multi-tenant software a little bit. But I think there's a few reasons. So one of them is definitely comfort, right? There is this sort of comfort level people have, and this will start to fade. But folks that select enterprise software feel some level of comfort still in the world of, I own my whatever. I own the software, which you never do. You own a license. I own my hardware, or I own the boundaries around my hardware. This is my server. I run it. It's ours. They feel more secure about their data. That is definitely a part of it. And then the other is going to be that, and maybe this is related, is that the software at this point is so old that it's harder for them to bring it forward without starting over. So you'll see an Oracle, they'll buy a NetSuite instead of trying to roll something on their own. SAP was kind of doing this with By Design and Business One, but they're not quite there yet. It's hard to rewrite software that's decades old.
Okay, so I think I'm seeing the latter of the case. Most of the CIOs, IT directors I'm talking to, they really want to get out of the hand-holding of patches and releases, because that's the bane of their existence. It's a headache. And they want to focus on the business value drivers that where they can add value, engage with the business, and drive things like AI and other things that are going to advance the business, as opposed to worrying about, oh no, we just did a patch release and we can't print checks. It doesn't work with the check printer. Stupid stuff like that. They want to get away from that,
right? Largely.
But the software companies are coming out still, these big enterprise companies saying, oh, we're in the cloud. But they really don't tell you, oh, by the way, you've got to maintain this stuff.
Yeah, or we're going to pass on hosting costs to you marked up 10%.
So if I'm a buyer out there, I really need to understand that model and drive into it. And that's where I would just say largely ignore the word cloud, because everybody's in the cloud. Everybody says they're in the cloud. What does that really look like, and what does that mean? And so how would a company even discern that in an evaluation process? Particularly a company that may not have someone like us helping them, because typically we know which companies are and which companies aren't effectively in the true cloud as NetSuite would define it, or a solution that was built in the cloud.
Right.
How do they get past all this stuff?
There's some key things to look for if you get to a point in a demo, and even things maybe you can glean from how they present themselves in a video. One of the ones that stood out in the selection you were alluding to for us earlier was that in our demo, the product was presented inside a virtual machine, and you could tell. So it was a remote desktop. You had to launch the software, and we asked them, is this the experience for your customers? Is this what they do? Well, that is 100% giveaway that software is running in a kind of siloed server somewhere, and it doesn't run from your web browser. So you lose a bunch of features that are kind of light touch, run from anywhere, multi-monitor support, things like that. So that was a dead giveaway for us right there.
And you have to install something on your laptop.
Yes, yeah, so that's another one. Or on the remote machine, but yes.
But something somewhere. If I don't have
running.
I have to run something inside my company so I can access your software.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a dead giveaway there. The opposite experience, a true cloud, if we keep using that term, experience would be fire up a web browser and log in. That's it.
That's sort of like I go into anything I use online. If I go to Amazon Shopping, banking, I don't need to go and download the Wells Fargo virtual machine, or I have an app, okay, but I can still access it over the web.
Yeah.
And the app just makes it easier for me to get to it. I have a little button as opposed to,
a little bit
type in a URL.
Optimized on your phone, etc.
Yeah.
And so this is the experience, for a lot of users, they've used QuickBooks Online for their smaller or, growing businesses. That's one of those that's a kind of the true cloud first step accounting system for a lot of folks. And then, again, we've talked about NetSuite or Acumatica. They're similar in that regard. And the big difference there is that the back end of it is controlled completely differently. It's a software that in the end has a singular version that's unified across their customers. It has shared infrastructure, which they invest in. They don't have to worry about whether or not that customer's revenue is way lower than this other's, and they spend more time maintaining their hardware. No, they invest in the infrastructure as a whole. They invest in the uptime as a whole. They invest in the patch management, the training documentation, the deployment, the communication to their customers. They get to unify all of those things and deliver, again, what we have effectively called now software as a service. You pay for a license to keep using it, maybe on a per user or like a named user or a bucket of licenses, and you run that inside your company. You run your security in your company, and then the vendor ultimately is responsible for everything else.
Okay, so let's forget the word cloud. Ignore that word and really get into the word software as a service and getting them to define what do they provide.
Right.
Customers should be looking at the software companies going, give us a list of stuff you're going to do as a service and then what we have to do.
Right.
And you look through that list, and if there's anything on the list except for enter invoices, pay bills, typical business stuff, post journal entries, post manufacturing transactions, anything that's IT related, you got to look at with scrutiny and go, okay, what does this mean? Update this or install this. And that's really what you're getting at, is looking at the contract and the agreement and diving into the aspects of what service are you providing, a true software as a service, as opposed to I'm giving you a software license. I'm actually giving you a service that's going to include all that technical stuff you just listed there.
Yeah.
That if you're not a technical person, it's a whole bunch of stuff you don't know what it is. But hopefully you have someone on your team who can filter through that and go, wait a minute, red flag.
Yeah, and it becomes pretty evident if you get to the stage of the pricing. I mean, demos should clue you in a little bit, but when they start breaking down pricing, the companies that are running true cloud do not have line items for, okay, you're on this spec of system with 4 virtual cores and 32 gigs of memory. They're not breaking down some spec of some server somewhere that has a hosting cost sort of explicitly. That is a kind of a single tenant, a private cloud, hybridized, a number of names for it. But that is not a software as a service whatsoever. You are isolated from the rest of the product.
So then here's the ultimate problem out there. The traditional companies that have been around for a long time, have the reputation, may not be truly software as a service, hands off, because they built their infrastructure, everything around a client server or a application that requires some interaction or capacity on the computer, the local computer, or servers in-house. Versus these newer, and some of them have been around a while. I'll give, like NetSuite, Acumatica, those credit, and even Intact. They've got recently bought by Sage. Give them credit. They were built in the cloud. They're newer, and I say newer, like less than 5-10 years. But then you have a lot of really, really newer ones. So if you actually go out there and get a list of ERP software, there's, some of these services where you can go out and look at reviews. There's 300-400 software companies out there that do provide ERP in some form or fashion. So you get these newer, and these newer ones, they are in the cloud.
Right.
And so you're as a buyer, you're going, wow, this is much better than the traditional ones. But what are the challenges with some of these newer ones that are out there?
That is a tricky space.
So how do you get past that?
I think you have to force the issue with them. What documentation can they provide you about the reality of using their product, right? So we've talked, you and I, offline here a little bit about uptime and SOC letters, right? SLAs. What do their SLAs look like? What guarantees do they provide you, if at all, that their product stays up? Because what you're describing is an infrastructure, a cloud infrastructure, a true cloud infrastructure, right? That will stay online. But what will the company do to make sure that their software stays online? So you're going to have to push them on that front.
Yeah, but here's their pitch. I hear this all the time. Hey, we're on AWS. And AWS has a SOC, and by the way, when we talk about SOC letters, that's essentially a certification from an independent, typically an accounting firm, that will basically do an audit of the company's processes to ensure the company has a secure environment and has the right governance and controls in place to run the company. And without the whole diving into SOC, I would encourage people to ask anybody if you're doing any type of transactions in your company, especially financial, they have a SOC letter. It's hard to set up processes to get a SOC letter. It doesn't cost much to actually get one.
Right.
But setting up that part of it almost ensures there's some credibility with the company where they've thought about security. You don't get a letter one day going, oh, by the way, our software was hacked. Mm-hmm. Here's the big pitch, though. They say, oh, we're on AWS or Azure. They're secure. They have a SOC letter. Does that mean anything?
It's not good enough.
That's not good enough.
No, that's not good enough. And like you said, it's a complex process to get through, but it's not a self-reported thing. It requires an audit. So that is a great point. If a company can represent that they are SOC 2 compliant, and that's usually the one we'll look for, SOC 1 would be much more difficult. That's a good indication that their business processes contain some of the things you might look for. That's like you said, governance, disaster recovery, backups, a lot of the things that are going to help keep a reliable software package running are accounted for.
And it's pretty thorough, and almost look at it as I almost equate it to Sarbanes-Oxley light, but it's more focused on the technology aspects of it. For example, do I have control over the code? Can anybody in the company update the code without getting approval? Do I have approvals in place? Todd, you spent several years at a software as a service company, and we went through that process.
Sure.
And it basically requires a lot of auditable documentation. You couldn't just upgrade the code and then move along your way. You had to get it approved. You had a testing process, and you had a checklist in the testing process. So there's those things to ensure the software all of a sudden doesn't crash in the middle of it. Now, okay, so going back to my original question, that's not good enough to say an AWS is SOC letter, because there's software that they've created that sits on AWS. That software itself has to have some level of integrity so that it actually runs effectively, it scales effectively, it processes transactions effectively. But if I start to scale up and grow, it doesn't have like limits on, maybe there's some algorithm in there, and all of a sudden if you've got 100 transactions pumping through in a few minutes, all of a sudden that algorithm takes 2 hours, as opposed to with exponentially it increases. What other things can happen?
In that circumstance, whatever things can happen, that's going to bog down, every single client on that product. So everybody's going to fall apart.
So everybody gets a mass letter. Sorry, we're down for the next 3 days. So that's the one thing to be
awful
cognizant of. If you're a company that's looking at maybe a newer company that maybe does or doesn't have a SOC letter, how critical is business operations? Let's say your software is down for a week. Would you lose revenue? Like, for example, our firm, Trinergy, if our accounting system was down for a week, we really wouldn't care, really. We could still do our client work and do what we need to do, and maybe it would cause a delay of a couple of days in getting a bill out or something. But if you're a company that's a e-commerce type company that's reliant on people going in and buying stuff,
if your storefront's down, there goes your revenue.
Yeah.
That's it.
You can't afford that. So you've got to make sure there's a level of good support out there, and they've got the right processes in place to, support that. You're not going to lose that. So that's the one critical thing to look at. What's critical to your company?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that's a nice wrap on sort of the topic where we may have been describing earlier in this podcast, the idea that cloud infrastructure is kind of the safe bet, the thing to look for, right? You've described the other end of it. Any company can just kind of present themselves brand new as a cloud-centric product, and it won't mean the same thing as when Microsoft says it.
Yeah, exactly. And to kind of encapsulate what we're talking about, there's two ends of the spectrum to be cautious on when looking at software. The end of the spectrum where it's a larger traditional company that really hasn't moved fully to a software as a service model or true cloud or whatever we want to call it, where everything is hands off and it just runs, and all I've got to do is make sure people are trained on the software, people know how to use it, I've configured it right, I've set it up right, versus, I'll say, the newer company that is in the true cloud. It's a true cloud, and it's software as a service. You don't have to do anything, but maybe they're newer, not as mature. It's a new company. They got a slick website, and sometimes you can't tell who owns the company. But I would say that's the other piece of it, too, is you go on their website, you can't figure out who owns the company. It's not transparent, and who's putting the money behind it. That's suspicious too, because let's say it's you're in the U.S. and the company's owned by a country that maybe is restricted to do business. I'll say they're a threat to the U.S. and there's a problem with that, and we cut off ties. Does your software go away, or are they other activities happening that maybe drive security concerns? Got to be cautious of that. So you go on their website, you should be able to see who owns them and where the money's coming from, who's funding them, and who's behind it. Understand their strategy, but then really understand what internal controls have they put in place to be able to certify that they have the right process so you don't lose the software for a week. Because the bigger thing is the security piece. Everybody thinks, oh, hackers are just after the big companies, but they hit the small companies too.
Oh, often, and they know they're softer targets. They may have to get 10 times as many of them as a target, but they are softer targets. And I guess what I want to point out real quickly is that these type of products are going to come up because where you'll usually bump into them is you do have a big ERP system, you're comfortable, it's working great. Let's say you have NetSuite, but you want some other specialized functionality in contract management or document management or some sort of payment processing or whatever. Somebody will bring this to you one day as a CIO or CAO or somebody like that, where they have a problem to solve. They went out and researched, hey, this company will do this. They said they'll do it for me. Let's add this on. There'll be dozens, if not hundreds of companies, little ones spun up like this to do the same kind of stuff. And you really got to put forward the due diligence to make sure they're not some fly-by-night operation.
Yeah, because you're actually integrating data with them and sharing data. And make sure all of a sudden you don't get the letter in the mail, we've been hacked. The smaller companies will say, oh, we've never been compromised. Well, yeah, you're not big enough yet. Not yet.
That's right. That's right. So look out for that, especially because they'll be happy to say, oh, we integrate with everything. Well, we integrate with NetSuite or SAP or whatever. They'll say lots of that stuff because they will hope that you hire them and help you work through that. So
or help them integrate for the first time.
Yeah. Well, right. All right. Use you as a learning experience and then lose a bunch of data. So yep, definitely be careful. Stick with the known players first and foremost when you can, and don't let the buzzwords trip you up.
If you guys have any questions, you can email Todd at Trenergy.com. So it's Todd at Trenergy.com. And as always, you can email Peter and I, Bill at Trenergy.com or Peter at Trenergy.com if you've got any other questions about this or anything else. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Bill.